My answer is no, Mr. Brooks. It will always be no. Olive Covington spoke those words with her chin raised and her dark eyes blazing, standing in the middle of the dusty main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1882, while every soul within 50 feet went completely still. The afternoon sun hammered down on the wooden storefronts and baked the red earth beneath her boots, and still she did not flinch. Not when Frederick Brooks stepped closer. Not when his jaw tightened in that particular way that made grown men cross the street. Not even when he leaned down, close enough that she could smell the cedar and leather of him, and said, very quietly, so only she could hear, "Then allow me to make a second offer, Miss Covington, and this one has nothing to do with business." Something cracked open inside her chest at those words, though she would sooner have swallowed a fistful of prairie dust than let him see it. She stepped back. Her heel caught on the edge of the raised boardwalk, and she stumbled, barely catching the hitching post before she went down into the street. Frederick's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her arm with a steadiness that infuriated her, because it was warm and it was sure, and it was exactly the kind of steadiness she had spent the last 2 years pretending she did not need. "I can stand on my own," she said. "I know you can," he answered, and he released her the instant she was steady, not a second before and not a second after. His gray eyes did not carry the triumph she expected. They carried something far more dangerous, something quiet and patient and completely certain. But the offer still stands, Olive. She had not given him permission to use her given name. She also did not correct him. She turned and walked back into the telegraph office without another word, and she sat down behind her desk and pressed her hands flat against the worn wooden surface and breathed until the shaking stopped. Outside, she could hear the street return to its ordinary noise, horses and wagon wheels and the distant clang of the blacksmith, the world rolling on as if nothing had just happened, as if Frederick Brooks had not just upended everything she had so carefully constructed. But things had not always been this way between them. And to understand what had shattered the careful distance between Frederick Brooks and Olive Covington in the summer of 1882, you had to go back to the beginning of it. Back to the autumn of 1880, when Olive first arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, with $43 sewn into the hem of her coat, a secret she intended to take to her grave, and absolutely no intention of trusting any man who walked on 2 legs. Caldwell in the autumn of 1880 was not a gentle place for a woman alone. It sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a dare, a town that existed to separate cowboys from their wages at the end of a cattle drive, with all the chaos and desperation that implied. The cattle trade was moving north and money moved through Caldwell in rivers, but so did trouble, and the two were almost always the same thing. Olive had chosen it specifically because no one from her past would think to look for her here. No one from Richmond, Virginia, would imagine that the daughter of the Covington family, however fallen that family's fortunes might be, would end up behind a telegraph operator's desk in a cattle town on the Kansas border. She had not run away from Richmond precisely. She had walked away, with her head up and her bags packed, and a formal, carefully worded letter left on the writing table informing her uncle that she would not be marrying Arthur Prescott, not for his debts, not for anyone's debts, and not under any circumstances she could imagine. Arthur Prescott was 47 years old, and he smelled of pipe tobacco and entitlement, and he had looked at Olive the way men looked at property they intended to acquire. Her uncle had arranged it all very neatly, trading her future for the cancellation of a debt he should never have incurred, and he had presented it to her at the dinner table one evening in October of 1880 as if he were doing her a tremendous favor. Olive had thanked him politely, excused herself, gone upstairs, packed everything she could carry, and was on the first train west by morning. She was 24 years old. She had a gift for mathematics and a talent for the telegraph key she had learned during 2 years of employment at the Richmond post office, and she had decided that she would make her own way or she would make nothing at all. She had not counted on Caldwell being quite this rough. She had not counted on the way men looked at a young woman alone, like something that needed to be explained or claimed or pitied. And she had absolutely not counted on Frederick Brooks. She met him on her third day in Caldwell, when she was still finding her footing at the telegraph office, and learning the rhythms of who came in and what they needed, and how to handle the ones who thought a woman behind the desk was an invitation to be familiar. Frederick had walked in shortly after noon, and the first thing she noticed was that he moved with an economy of motion that spoke of someone who had never needed to perform his own authority for anyone. He was tall, with dark hair and those storm-gray eyes, somewhere in his early 30s, wearing a coat that had seen real work but still fit him with a precision that suggested he paid attention to things most men let slide. He had a face that would have been handsome if it had been arranged differently, but it was arranged with a kind of severity that made handsome beside the point. It was a face that made you pay attention. He placed his telegram request on the counter without preamble. Olive looked at it. It was a business communication to a land office in Wichita, terse and specific, the language of someone who wasted nothing, not words and not money and apparently not time either, because he was already looking at her with those gray eyes as if waiting for her to confirm she understood. "This will go out within the hour," she told him. "I know it will," he said, which was not the response she had expected, and left before she could decide how to feel about it. She asked Martha Aldridge, who ran the boarding house where Olive had taken a room, about him that evening over supper. Martha was a woman of 50 who had outlasted 2 husbands and a cattle stampede and had opinions about everything and shared them with a generosity that Olive found both overwhelming and deeply useful. She lit up at the question. "Frederick Brooks," Martha said, pouring more coffee into Olive's cup without asking. "Now there is a man with a story. He owns the Doubleby spread about 12 miles northeast, run it for 4 years now. Before that he came up from Texas, though nobody's quite gotten the full tale out of him about what happened down there. He's fair to his hands, pays on time, doesn't gamble the ranch away, doesn't drink himself into a ditch every Saturday. In Caldwell that makes him a near saint." "Is he married?" Olive asked and then immediately wished she had not. Martha's eyebrows did something interesting. "Was," she said after a pause. "His wife passed, about 3 years back now, fever. They say he took it very hard. He doesn't speak of it." Olive filed that information carefully in the part of her mind she reserved for facts that mattered, told herself it did not matter in the slightest, and went back to her supper. She saw Frederick Brooks regularly after that. Caldwell was not a large town, and the telegraph office was a necessary stop for a rancher who conducted the volume of business he did. He was always direct, always precise, and he treated her with a professional courtesy that she found both entirely appropriate and mildly irritating, in a way she could not fully articulate. He did not flirt. He did not condescend. He did not ask her personal questions or make unnecessary conversation or look at her the way Arthur Prescott had looked at her. He simply conducted his business and left. The problem was that she noticed him every single time. She noticed the way he held his hat in his hand instead of wearing it inside, the small, habitual courtesy of it. She noticed the calluses on his hands from actual work. She noticed that when he spoke to his ranch hands outside the telegraph office, there was no edge of cruelty in his voice, only command and respect in equal measure. She noticed that he was quietly, extraordinarily competent at everything she had seen him attempt, which was unfair and also impossible to ignore. She told herself firmly and repeatedly that she was not interested in Frederick Brooks or any other man, that she had come to Caldwell to build her own life, and she was doing exactly that, and that noticing someone's gray eyes across a telegraph counter was not the same as caring about them. She was, she discovered over the following months, reasonably good at lying to other people but not particularly good at lying to herself. The first time Frederick spoke to her outside the bounds of strictly necessary business was in the spring of 1881, 6 months after she had arrived. She had been leaving the mercantile with a package of supplies, and she had dropped the whole thing in the mud near the entrance to the alley beside the general store, and she was on her knees collecting scattered items and trying not to say words that would have shocked Martha Aldridge, when a pair of boots appeared beside her, and Frederick Brooks crouched down and began collecting things alongside her without a word of commentary. "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said, handing her a paper-wrapped bundle of coffee. They collected everything in silence. He handed the last item, a small jar of ink, to her with a care that seemed disproportionate to the object, and she took it. And for a moment they were just looking at each other, close enough that she could see the exact shade of gray his eyes were, which was the color of storm clouds when they were serious about what they were doing. "Miss Covington," he said, and he stood and offered her a hand up, which she took because her knees were muddy and her dignity was already somewhat compromised. "Are you settling in well?" "Very well, thank you," she said, which was mostly true. He nodded as if he had asked a real question and received a real answer, and went on his way. She stood in the street with her package and her muddy knees and felt something she could not name, and she walked home thinking about it all evening. After that, there was a shift between them, so gradual and so subtle that she might have imagined it, except that she absolutely did not imagine things. The conversations at the telegraph counter grew fractionally longer. He began asking, occasionally, how she was managing, with a specificity that suggested he was paying attention to what she told him. Once, when a particularly difficult customer had been making her life unpleasant for 2 weeks, Frederick had walked in during one of the man's loudest complaints and had simply stood there, looking at the man with an expression of absolute and unimpressed calm, until the man had run out of bluster and left. Frederick had said nothing about it after, just placed his telegram request on the counter as usual. "Thank you," Olive had said. "Business," he had replied, which was clearly not what it was, but she let it go. By the autumn of 1881, a full year after she had arrived in Caldwell, Olive had built a life that was genuinely hers and genuinely good. She had her job. She had Martha's boarding house and Martha's friendship, which was worth considerably more than the room. She had a small circle of women in the town whom she liked, particularly Clara Holt, who taught the school, and Rosa Mendez, whose family ran the Mexican restaurant on the south end of town, and whose green chili stew was the finest thing Olive had ever eaten. She was not wealthy. She was not comfortable by the standards of where she had come from. But she was free, and free had turned out to be worth everything she had given up to have it. It was in that autumn that she began to understand that Frederick Brooks had also been watching her, in the same careful and patient way that she had been trying not to watch him. He had asked her to dinner once, in October of 1881. He had been straightforward about it, no elaborate ceremony, just a direct question as he was collecting his telegram receipt. She had said no, politely and with what she hoped was an air of finality, and she had told herself it was because she was not ready for any of it, not dinner and not whatever dinner would mean. He had accepted it without any visible change in his expression, said, "Of course, Miss Covington," and that had been the end of it. Except it hadn't been, because nothing with Frederick Brooks ever quite ended. It just changed form and waited. The event that made everything come to a point happened in February of 1882. There was a man who came to town named Gerald Coates, who had the look and manner of someone whose business was largely conducted in the gray areas of the law. He was from Dodge City originally, and he had set his eye on a piece of land that sat between the Double-B and the eastern edge of Caldwell proper, a stretch of land that had belonged to an elderly homesteader named Elias Marsh, who had died the previous December without any living family that anyone knew of. Coates had somehow gotten himself named as the executor of Marsh's affairs, which nobody in Caldwell quite understood but which nobody had moved quickly enough to challenge. And he was in the process of arranging the sale of Marsh's land to a cattle operation out of Texas that would, if they moved in, essentially cut off the water access that 3 smaller homesteads depended on. One of those homesteads was run by a widow named June Carver, who had 2 sons, and who had been Olive's neighbor back at the boarding house before she had moved to a proper room of her own at Clara Holt's place. Olive had become aware of what Coates was doing because everything in Caldwell that went through official channels went through the telegraph office first, and Olive had good eyes and a good mind, and a very clear understanding of what the language in certain documents meant when you understood who was behind them. She also had $43 that had grown, through careful management and the modest but steady wages of her position, into a sum that was not large but was not nothing either. She did what she did because it was the right thing to do, and because June Carver had brought her soup when she was ill and had a laugh that lit up every room she was in and deserved better than what Coates was arranging for her. Olive wrote 3 carefully worded letters. One went to the county land office in Wichita, citing a specific section of Kansas statute regarding the proper process for contested estate executorships. One went to the state newspaper in Topeka. The third went to a lawyer in Wichita named Daniel Howe, whom she had found referenced in a back issue of the Caldwell commercial that Martha had kept in a stack in the parlor. She did not tell anyone she had done this. She did not need to, because the results arrived in Caldwell inside of 6 weeks. Coates' executorship was challenged by the county land office. The newspaper published a story about disputed land rights and water access that made the Texas cattle operation quietly reconsider the acquisition. And when the dust settled, June Carver and her 2 neighboring homesteaders found that the land had been placed in proper probate and their water access was legally secured. Coates left Caldwell in March of 1882 in a state of fury that he directed at nobody in particular, which was probably wise, since in Caldwell fury directed at nobody in particular tended to stay theoretical. What Olive had not anticipated was that Frederick Brooks had been watching all of this very carefully. He had come into the telegraph office the week after Coates left town, and instead of placing a telegram request on the counter, he had placed his hands on the counter and looked at her in a way that was different from his usual directness, different in a way that made something in her chest do something inconvenient. "I know what you did," he said. She kept her expression exactly level. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Mr. Brooks. Those letters to Wichita, the newspaper contact, he was not accusing her, he was simply acknowledging a fact. Coates had the documentation to stand up to casual scrutiny, but not to the kind of scrutiny you apparently know how to apply. Anyone with access to the statutes could have done the same," she said. "But they didn't," he said. "You did." There was a silence between them that felt dense with things that had been building for a year and a half and that neither of them had yet put into words. "What I'd like to propose," Frederick said carefully, "is a business arrangement. I beg your pardon. The Double-B needs someone who can manage correspondence, legal letters, business communications. Someone with the kind of attention to detail and the particular understanding of documentation that you clearly have." He looked at her steadily. "I'm prepared to offer a salary considerably above what the telegraph office pays, with your own office space and flexible hours that would allow you to keep your position here if you preferred. I'm not asking you to give anything up. I'm asking if you'd be willing to add something on." Olive studied him for a long moment. She understood, with a clarity that was its own kind of discomfort, that what he was offering was legitimate. It was a real offer with real terms and real value, and he meant every word of it exactly as he had said it. She also understood with that same clarity that accepting it would put her in Frederick Brooks's orbit in a way that was fundamentally different from telegram requests across a counter, and that she was not sure she trusted herself in that orbit. "No," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks, but no." He had looked at her for one quiet moment, not with hurt, not with frustration, just with that steady patience that was so entirely characteristic of him, and then he had nodded and said, "Of course, Miss Covington," and taken his leave. She had told herself she had made the right decision. She had spent the following 2 months being unsettled in a way that was difficult to manage, which was not characteristic of her, and which she resented. She was not sleeping as well as she had been. She found herself thinking about Frederick Brooks at inconvenient moments, about the things he had said and the way he had said them, about the story Martha had told her of his wife, and what it meant to take a loss that hard and still go on running a ranch and conducting your business with integrity. She thought about his hands on the counter and the stillness of him when he was certain about something. She also thought, with a frequency she found alarming, about what it would mean to be trusted the way he had indicated he trusted her with that offer. She had not been trusted like that in a very long time. She had been used, enrichment, arranged and transacted and managed. She had not been trusted with something real. It was the end of May when June Carver said something to her that she had been trying not to think about since. They had been having coffee at Rosa Mendez's restaurant, all three of them, one of their regular Saturday afternoons, and June had said, out of the particular blue that June Carver was prone to operating from, "You know Frederick Brooks asks about you." Olive had been very careful with her coffee cup. "Does he?" "Not in any particular way," June said, which was unconvincing. "He sees me in town and he asks how you're doing. He's been doing it for months." "He's doing it because he feels responsible," Clara said, which was the kind of thing Clara said when she was trying to be helpful and didn't quite land it. "Because of the Coates business." "He does not feel responsible," June said, with the certainty of a woman who had been watching people for a long time. "He's asking because he wants to know. There's a difference." Olive had changed the subject with a decisiveness that made both of them look at her, with the particular expression that women had when they knew something you weren't quite ready to know yet. She had gone home and thought about it for 3 days, and then told herself firmly to stop thinking about it and go on with her life, which worked beautifully right up until the afternoon in June of 1882, when she was walking back from the post office and nearly ran straight into Frederick Brooks outside the hardware store, and he steadied her by the arm, and they stood there in the summer heat looking at each other from a distance of about 6 inches. And something in the space between them felt so charged with everything that had not been said for a year and a half that she stepped back quickly and said good afternoon and walked away at a pace that was probably undignified. 2 days after that was when he came to the telegraph office again. He had not come with a telegram request. He had simply come in and stood at the counter and looked at her, and then he said, "My offer still stands, Miss Covington, the business arrangement." She had looked back at him and known, with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with all the careful attention she had been paying to Frederick Brooks for nearly 2 years, that he knew she would refuse again. He was not making this offer because he expected her to accept it. He was making it because he wanted to say something to her that he had not yet found the right way to say, and this was the door he knew how to open. "My answer is still no," she said. He nodded slowly. He picked up his hat from the counter where he had set it, and then he paused. "Then allow me to make a second offer," he said, "and this one has nothing to do with business." She felt her heart do something she would later describe to herself as deeply unhelpful. "I'd like to court you properly, Olive." He said her name with a quietness that made it feel like something entirely different from the name everyone else used. "I know you said no to dinner, and I respected that. I know you have good reasons for keeping your walls where they are, and I'm not asking you to knock them down. I'm just asking if you'd allow me to try, to take the time, to let you see what it looks like when someone means what they say." She stared at him. The telegraph office was small and warm and smelled of ink and paper and the faint remnant of the afternoon's dust, and she was standing in it looking at Frederick Brooks, who was standing there being exactly what he had always been, steady and patient and entirely sincere, and she did not know what to do with any of it. "You should know," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended, "that I am not a woman who is going to simply agree to things because they're offered." "I would think considerably less of you if you were," he said. "I have a past that is complicated. So do I. I'm not going to rearrange my life around someone else's plans. I'm not asking you to rearrange anything. I'm asking you to have dinner with me." A pause. "One dinner," she said. "One dinner," he agreed. There was no triumph in his face. There was only that thing she had been trying not to see for 2 years, the thing that looked like the particular hope of a person who had learned to be careful with hope because he knew exactly how much it cost when it failed. "Saturday," she said. "Not at the hotel. Too many people will watch." "Rosa Mendez's restaurant," he offered. She felt something inside her loosen just slightly. "Rosa Mendez's restaurant," she agreed. He put his hat back on and walked out of the telegraph office, and Olive sat down behind her desk and pressed her hands flat on the wood and breathed. And this time the shaking felt less like fear and more like the particular feeling of standing at the edge of something vast and realizing you might actually step out. She told Martha Aldridge that evening. Martha sat very still for approximately 4 seconds, which was the longest Olive had ever seen her sit still, and then she said, "Well, it is about time," and poured them both a considerably larger amount of coffee than was strictly advisable at 9 in the evening. "It is one dinner," Olive said. "Of course it is," Martha said, which managed to convey complete disbelief in 4 words. "I am not making any decisions about anything. I simply agreed to one meal." "Absolutely," Martha said, and handed her the coffee with an expression of pure satisfaction. Olive went to bed that night and looked at the ceiling of her room for a long time, thinking not about the dinner or about Frederick or about any of the things that were obviously worth thinking about, but about the moment when he had said her name and how it had felt like something being returned that she had not known she had lost. She was 25 now. She had built something real here. She was not the girl who had been traded like a debt between men in Richmond, and she was not going to become that. But she was beginning to understand, not quite the woman who needed walls quite as thick as the ones she had been maintaining either. Walls kept things out. They also, she had been slowly discovering, kept things in. She was thinking about the secret she carried, the dark past she had never told anyone in Caldwell. The reason she had been so careful, so deliberately self-contained. There was something that had happened in Richmond, not just the business with Arthur Prescott and her uncle, but something before that, something that had made trusting anyone feel like a trap. His name had been Daniel Whitmore, and she had trusted him completely when she was 22. She had trusted him with her heart, and with things she had told no one else, and he had taken that trust and used it with a precise and calculated cruelty that had nothing to do with any feeling he had ever had for her and everything to do with a business connection he had been trying to establish with her uncle. She had been a means to an end. She had found out when she overheard a conversation she was never meant to hear, one of those devastating revelations that arrive in ordinary moments with completely extraordinary consequences. She had learned from that to read people very carefully. She had learned to watch for the gap between what people said and what they did. She had been watching Frederick Brooks for nearly 2 years and she could not find the gap. That was what frightened her more than anything else, that she could not find it. Saturday arrived with the kind of summer evening that made even Caldwell look beautiful, the sky going pink and orange over the flat edge of the prairie, the heat finally easing into something breathable after sunset. Olive wore her best dress, which was dark blue and well-made even if it was 2 years old, and she pinned her dark hair up with a care she told herself was purely about presentable appearance and nothing else. Frederick was already at Rose's when she arrived, which she had half expected. He stood when she came in, which she had also half expected, but what she had not expected was the expression on his face when he saw her, an expression so unguarded and so direct that she had to look away for a moment to collect herself. Rosa Mendez, who knew absolutely everything that was worth knowing in Caldwell, had given them the corner table, the one slightly removed from the main room, and she brought them her green chili stew and warm tortillas and a small clay pitcher of water, and left them entirely alone with the efficiency of someone who understood that some conversations needed room. They talked for 3 hours. Olive could not have said afterward what she had expected, but it was not this. She had expected careful, managed conversation. She had expected Frederick to be impressive in a deliberate way, to say the right things with the calculation of someone trying to win a negotiation. What she got instead was something she had not experienced in a very long time, the particular pleasure of talking to someone who was genuinely curious, who listened the way he looked at things, with complete attention and no agenda beyond understanding. He told her about Texas. He had grown up near San Antonio, on a smaller ranch than the Doubleby. He had come to Kansas after his father's ranch was sold to cover debts when he was 26. He had started with nothing and bought his first piece of land with 5 years of work as a trail hand, which accounted for the calluses and the economy of motion. He told her about the land, about what it meant to him, not as an investment but as something he had made real out of effort and intention, and there was nothing performed in the way he said it. She told him, carefully at first and then with increasing honesty, about Richmond. Not about Daniel Whitmore, not yet. She was not ready to put that on the table between them. But about her family, about the decline of the Covington fortunes that her uncle had managed with spectacular incompetence, about her uncle's attempt to arrange her marriage to Arthur Prescott, about the morning she had gotten on the train. "Were you afraid?" Frederick asked. She considered the question seriously. "I was more afraid of what I was leaving behind than of where I was going," she said. "That sounds wrong, but it isn't. Going forward is always easier than staying somewhere that's killing you slowly." He was quiet for a moment, and she looked up and found him watching her with an expression that had something almost painful in it. Not pity, nothing as condescending as pity, but the recognition of someone who understood exactly what she was describing. "I know something about that," he said, and she understood that he meant his wife, and she did not push because she had learned that some things needed to be offered in their own time. "Martha told me," she said gently, "that you lost her. I'm sorry." He looked down at his hands for a moment. "Her name was Catherine," he said. "We were well matched. I think if she had lived we would have been happy. That's the hardest part, actually. Not knowing is one thing. Knowing it was possible and that it was simply taken by something as arbitrary as a fever is another thing entirely. I think grief that's been carried alone gets very heavy," she said. He looked at her directly. "Yes," he said, "it does." They walked back through town after Rosa insisted they take a tin of her almond cookies for the road, and the night was warm and the stars were very clear overhead, the big sky of the plains doing what it did best, which was making everything feel both very small and very possible. Frederick walked beside her, close enough that his arm occasionally brushed hers, and she did not move away. At the door to Clara Holt's house, where she had her room now, she stopped and turned to face him. "Thank you," she said, "for the dinner." "Thank you for coming," he said. He held his hat in his hands again, that habitual courtesy. "I would like to do it again if you're willing." She looked at him in the warm Kansas night and thought about walls and about what they cost. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." The courtship that followed was unlike anything Olive had anticipated, and she was a woman who prided herself on anticipating things. It was slow, which she had expected. It was steady, which she had expected. What she had not expected was how much she came to look forward to each piece of it. The Sunday afternoon walks along the edge of town where the prairie started and the world opened up. The way Frederick always found something to say that was worth saying. The evenings in Martha's parlor when he would come to call, and they would sit and talk, while Martha pretended to be absorbed in her knitting. She had not expected the ease of it. She had spent so long bracing for people's hidden motives that she had forgotten what it felt like when someone simply had no hidden motives, when what you saw was precisely what was there. In August, she told him about Daniel Whitmore. She had not planned to. They were sitting on the edge of the bluff east of town, where the land dipped down toward the creek, one of their usual Sunday spots, and she had been thinking about the way the light came across the flat grass. And then she had been thinking about how she had not allowed herself this, sitting somewhere quiet with someone she trusted, in so long that she had almost forgotten it was possible, and the thought had broken something loose inside her that had been sealed for a long time. And she started talking before she had quite decided to. She told him everything. About Daniel, about what she had believed and what had been real and what had been used. About the conversation she had overheard. About the particular devastation of discovering that someone had treated her heart as a business transaction. Frederick listened without interrupting, without making the small sounds of sympathy that she had learned to find irritating because they were usually just impatience dressed up in consideration. He just listened, and when she was done, there was a silence that felt very clean. "That is why you said no to the business offer," he said. "Partly," she said. "It looked too similar. A man offering me something that seemed legitimate, presenting it in business terms. But you knew it wasn't really about the letters." "I suspected," she said. "I wasn't sure." "It wasn't," he said, without a trace of equivocation. "I have a perfectly competent person in Wichita who manages my legal correspondence. I was looking for a reason to be in your life more than the telegraph counter allowed." He said it calmly, as if he were simply acknowledging something they both already knew. "I should probably have found a less convoluted approach." She looked at him. Something in the honesty of it, the complete absence of any attempt to make himself look better than he was, reached somewhere very deep inside her and settled there like a stone finding the bottom of a clear creek. "You should probably have just told me the truth directly," she said. "You would have said no." "I absolutely would have," she agreed, "but I appreciate the honesty about it now." He reached over and took her hand. He did it the way he did most things, simply and without ceremony, and held it the way you held something you intended to keep. She let him. They sat there in the August heat with the creek below them and the sky above them, and she felt something that she recognized, eventually, as the absence of bracing, the absence of waiting for the thing behind the thing. She was just sitting beside someone who meant her well, holding his hand, in the particular peace of a Kansas summer afternoon. Frederick kissed her for the first time on a Tuesday in September, which was a completely ordinary day for everything except that, and which was the day that Olive Covington understood that she had been wrong about herself in one particular respect. She had told herself that she was building a life that did not require anyone else, and she had been building a genuinely good life, but she had been wrong about the requirement. Not wrong about the life, but wrong about the requirement. You could build something real alone. You could also build something real with someone, and the two were not mutually exclusive, and she had been confusing self-sufficiency with self-isolation for longer than she wanted to admit. It was the kind of kiss that was nothing like the overtures she had received from men who were interested in Olive Covington as a thing to be acquired. It was the kind of kiss you gave someone you had been paying attention to for a very long time and were very glad to finally be close to. She kissed him back with a directness that seemed to surprise him, and then she pulled back and looked at him with the particular expression she had been told, by people who knew her well, could be somewhat intimidating. "If you are keeping anything from me," she said, "now would be the time." "I'm not," he said. "If that changes, I expect to be told immediately." "Agreed," he said. "Good," she said, and kissed him again. Frederick Brooks had a dark past of his own, and he told her the rest of it in October, when the summer heat had broken, and the plains were doing the thing they did in autumn, which was turning a dozen shades of gold and amber that made everything look like it had been gilded from the inside. He had been involved, years ago in Texas, in a dispute over water rights that had turned ugly in ways he had not fully foreseen and had not managed well. There had been a man killed, not by Frederick's hand, but by someone in the employ of the landowner Frederick had been working for at the time, and Frederick had known what was coming and had not stopped it, and that knowledge had been sitting in him for a decade. He had left Texas because he could not stay and be the person who knew and had done nothing. He had come to Kansas and built something different from scratch, something he could look at without flinching, and the Doubleby was not just a ranch. It was a kind of answer to a question he had been asking himself for 10 years. "I'm not a man without sin," he told her, which was so utterly direct that she almost laughed, and which was also the truest thing she had ever heard anyone say. "Neither am I," she said, "though my particular sins run more toward the category of being too proud to ask for help when I need it." "I've noticed," he said, and the edge of warmth in his voice when he said it did something complicated to her composure. Clara Holt noticed the change in Olive with the perceptive silence of a woman who lived in close quarters with someone and paid attention. She said nothing until November, when Olive came home from a Sunday afternoon with Frederick, and Clara was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee already poured, which meant she had been watching for her out the window. "You're happy," Clara said, with the directness that made her a good teacher. Olive sat down and took her coffee. "I believe I might be," she said, which from Olive Covington was the equivalent of most people shouting from the rooftops. Clara smiled. It was a warm, complete smile, the smile of someone who had been hoping for this particular outcome for some time. "He's a good man, Olive." "I'm aware," Olive said. "You two are ridiculous," Clara added, in a fond tone. "In case nobody said that clearly." "Several people have," Olive said. By the winter of 1882, Caldwell had settled into its cold season rhythms, the cattle drives done for the year, the town quieter without the cowboys moving through, the sky lower and grayer and full of the particular promise of snow that the plains delivered with impressive determination. Olive had begun, very gradually and with absolute stealth, allowing herself to imagine the future. Not in the desperate, grasping way she had seen other women imagine futures with men who were not worth the imagining, but in the quiet, considered way she approached everything that mattered. She thought about what it would look like to share a life with someone who was honest, who listened, who had built his own integrity out of hard experience and kept it. She thought about the Doubleby and the land she had visited twice now, 12 miles northeast of Caldwell, and how it had surprised her by feeling, unexpectedly, like something that could become a home. She thought about children, which surprised her more than the land did. She had not thought concretely about children before, had filed the possibility under someday and left it there. But she found herself thinking about it now with a specificity that told her something about what she was beginning to want. She also thought, because she was Olive Covington and she thought about things thoroughly, about whether she would keep working when, and if the future she was imagining became real. The answer was yes, in some form. Not necessarily the telegraph office, though she had genuine affection for it. But the particular work she did well, the careful reading of documents and situations, the writing of letters that accomplished things, the kind of mind she had that saw what was actually happening in a situation rather than what was presented, that was not something she was interested in setting aside. She told Frederick this in January of 1883, sitting by the stove in Martha's parlor where they had taken to spending Thursday evenings. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking your permission," she clarified. "I know that too," he said, with the slight edge of amusement that she had learned was there if you knew to look for it under the usual gravity. "I was hoping you'd agree to manage the land records for the Doubleby, actually, given that you declined my previous business offer on those grounds." She looked at him. "That is completely different from your previous offer, is it? You're not trying to put me in your orbit with a business pretext this time." "No," he agreed. "I'm just asking you directly because I genuinely need someone with your skills and because you would be excellent at it. And because I'd be at the ranch," she said. "And because you'd be at the ranch," he agreed. She thought about it for a moment. "A fair wage," she said, "not a courtesy arrangement, a real one." "Whatever you think is fair," he said. She considered further. "Yes, then," she said, "when the time is appropriate." "When would that be?" he asked, and there was something under the question that she understood perfectly well. She looked at him across the warm parlor room with the stove ticking and Martha's needles clicking and the winter wind moving outside, and felt the clarity of someone who has finally stopped being afraid of the thing they want. "Frederick," she said, "are you going to ask me to marry you, or are you going to make me sit here waiting while you figure out how to phrase it?" He blinked, which was the most startled she had ever seen him look, and then he laughed, which was a sound she had not heard enough of and which did things to the winter evening that no stove could match. "Olive Covington," he said, after a moment, and he reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, which told her he had already worked out how to phrase it and had simply been waiting for the right moment, and that the right moment had apparently been this unremarkable Thursday evening in January. "Will you marry me?" The ring was simple, a plain gold band with a small inset stone, and she looked at it and then at him and said, "Yes, obviously yes." "You have been waiting long enough, and so have I." Martha Aldridge made a sound from the other side of the room that was mostly covered by the sudden activity of her knitting needles, and both of them pretended not to hear it. They were married in March of 1883, a Wednesday afternoon, in the small church on the north end of Caldwell that had a bell that didn't quite work, but that the congregation rang anyway out of stubborn affection. Clara Holt was Olive's attendant. Rosa Mendez made enough food to feed the entire town, which she appeared to have done by design. Martha Aldridge sat in the front row and cried without any apparent embarrassment, which Olive found entirely appropriate. Frederick's best man was his ranch foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Thomas Rays, who had been with the Doubleby since the beginning and who shook Olive's hand after the ceremony with a warmth that told her he approved, which she found mattered more than she would have predicted. The ceremony was short. The vows were simple. When the minister asked if she took Frederick Brooks as her husband, Olive said, "I do," with a conviction that made the minister blink, as if he had not expected quite that much clarity in the answer. Frederick looked at her the entire time with the expression she had learned over the preceding months, was what Frederick Brooks looked like when he was precisely where he intended to be. They moved to the Doubleby the following week. The ranch house was larger than she had expected, built with the same economy and intention that characterized everything Frederick did, plain and solid and well-made, with a kitchen window that looked east toward where the sun came up over the prairie in the mornings. Olive stood at that window on her first morning there and watched the light come in across the flat land and understood, with a certainty that sat very quietly inside her, that she had arrived somewhere. The Doubleby was not an easy life. Frederick had always been clear about that, and she had never wanted easy, exactly, only honest. The work was real and the days were long in the summer, and the winters on the plains were a serious proposition. Olive took up the land records and the correspondence with a thoroughness that Thomas Rays later said had saved the ranch a considerable sum in disputed boundary negotiations, which she accepted as the compliment it was. She also continued to maintain a connection to Caldwell and to the people there, because she had not stopped being who she was, and who she was included those friendships and that community. Frederick gave her the full run of the household accounts within a month of their marriage, which was a statement of trust that she recognized clearly for what it was, and which she honored by managing them with a precision that improved their margins measurably within 6 months. She also, not long after arriving at the Doubleby, began to understand something about Frederick that she had not had the close daily proximity to observe before, which was the care he took with the people who worked for him. The ranch employed 11 men, most of them long-term, and Frederick knew the details of each of their situations with a specificity that was not performative. When one of the younger hands, a 19-year-old named Miguel, broke his arm in an accident with a horse and could not work for 2 months, Frederick kept him on at full wages without making anything of it. When Thomas Rays's mother came up from Texas and needed a place to stay while she was ill, Frederick gave them the small foreman's cottage without being asked. "You do this quietly," Olive said to him one evening after one of these instances. "There's no other way to do it," he said, as if this were self-evident. "Most men in your position would want it known." "Most men in my position want to feel generous," he said. "That's different from being it." She looked at him and felt, as she frequently did in these moments, the particular warmth of being married to someone who was genuinely good in the ways that counted, not in the visible and socially rewarding ways, but in the quiet, habitual, unremarked ways that were the actual measure of character. By June of 1883, 3 months after their wedding, Olive knew she was expecting. She told Frederick in the morning, standing in the kitchen with the eastern light coming through the window the way it did, direct and clear. He went very still, and then he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her carefully, as if she were suddenly and wonderfully fragile. "You are allowed to say something," she told the front of his shirt. "I'm saying it," he said, which made absolutely no sense and which she understood completely. The pregnancy was not easy. The summer heat was relentless, and the ranch was busy, and Olive, who did not believe in slowing down unnecessarily, found that her body had strong opinions about the subject that she was not fully in a position to argue with. Frederick was attentive without being suffocating about it, a balance she suspected he had worked out with some care, and Thomas Ray's began quietly managing things in ways that reduced her workload without making it obvious, which she recognized and appreciated even as she pretended not to notice. Rosa Mendez came out to the Doubleby regularly through the summer and autumn with food and company, and the particular practical wisdom of a woman who had raised 4 children. Clara Holt wrote long letters. Martha Aldridge wrote shorter ones that said more. On a clear morning in late February of 1884, Olive gave birth to a boy. They named him James, after Frederick's father, and he came into the world with his father's dark hair and his mother's clear, serious eyes. And he was, from the first moment, so entirely and completely himself that Olive found herself thinking, looking at him, that all the things she had survived had been worth surviving for exactly this. Frederick held his son with the same steadiness with which he held everything, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. "He looks like you," she said. "He has your eyes," Frederick said. "He's going to have an opinion about everything," she said, "if either of those things is true." "Then he'll fit right in," Frederick said, and looked at her over their son's dark head with the particular warmth that had been building between them for 4 years now, and that had become the reliable, daily, sustaining thing she had never expected her life to contain. James turned out to be, as predicted, a child with opinions. He also turned out to be bright and kind in the way that children are when they grow up in houses where those things are modeled without self-consciousness, and he was fascinated by horses from the moment he could point at one, and by the prairie dogs that tunneled below the east pasture, and by the way the telegraph key worked when Olive occasionally brought it out to show him. In the spring of 1885, they had a daughter. They named her Ruth, after Olive's mother, and Ruth arrived in the world loud and decided and immediately the most interesting person in any room she occupied. She had Frederick's gray eyes and Olive's dark hair, and from approximately her second week of life, demonstrated a complete imperviousness to being ignored that James found fascinating and Thomas Ray's found hilarious. Frederick expanded the ranch house that year to accommodate a proper family room, doing some of the work himself with Thomas Ray's over a summer of evenings, and Olive sat on the porch in the last light sometimes, and watched them working and thought about all the versions of herself that had existed before this one, and felt a gratitude that was not about debt or relief, but about the particular sweetness of arriving somewhere you had not known to look for. The Doubleby prospered. The land records Olive maintained helped Frederick navigate 2 significant boundary disputes in 1885 and 1886, both of which were resolved in the Doubleby's favor without litigation, which saved them a sum of money that they put toward improving the water systems on the ranch. The cattle business was good, the demand strong, and Frederick ran the operation with the same integrity that characterized everything he did. Olive also, by 1886, had begun doing something she had not initially planned. She had been helping June Carver with some documentation related to June's property title, something the settlement of Elias Marsh's estate had complicated slightly, and word had spread in the way that words spread in small communities. Specifically, and with some speed, that Olive Brooks had a talent for navigating legal paperwork that was valuable and accessible. She began receiving requests for help from other homesteaders in the region, women in particular, widows and single women who were trying to hold on to land in the face of the various forces that made it difficult for women to do so in 1886 Kansas. She did not charge for most of it. Some she did, when the people asking could pay, and when not charging would have felt like charity rather than service. But the work meant something to her, the particular work of using what she knew and what she could do to help people navigate systems that were not designed to help them. It connected to what she had done for June Carver in 1882, the thing that had started this whole chain of events, and she thought occasionally about how peculiar it was that a wrong being done to someone else had been the thing that finally cracked the careful distance she had been maintaining between herself and the rest of her life. Frederick had known from early on what she was doing. He had said when she first mentioned it only, "Let me know if there's anything from the ranch you need, paper or postage or anything else," which was his way of saying he was behind her entirely without turning it into a speech about it. She had told him then that she loved him because the moment had required it. He had looked at her with those gray eyes that she knew better than she knew her own face and said, "I know," and then, after a moment, "I love you too, Olive. I have been trying to find ways to show you that clearly for about 4 years. You have done a very thorough job of it," she told him. "You're a hard audience," he said. "I am," she agreed. "It turns out I was worth the effort." "Yes," he said, without any hesitation whatsoever, "you were." They were sitting on the porch of the Doubleby when this conversation happened, in the summer of 1886, with James running after prairie dogs in the east pasture, and Ruth attempting to boss the ranch cat into a series of positions, the cat found entirely beneath her dignity, and the evening coming in across the Kansas plain in all its unreasonable beauty, and this was a moment, Olive thought, that she would hold onto forever. The summer of 1887 brought a drought that tested the Doubleby and every ranch and homestead in the region. Water became precious and disputes arose in the way that they always arose when something essential was scarce. Frederick navigated it with the same steady patience he brought to everything, working with neighboring ranchers on a shared water management arrangement that Olive helped document and formalize, a small cooperative agreement that several of the homesteaders also joined. It was during the drought that a homesteader to the south of the Doubleby, a man named Walt Greenfield, began encroaching on the shared creek access in a way that was not subtle and not legal. Olive wrote 3 letters, the first to the county, the second to a lawyer in Wichita, the third, which she showed to Frederick before she sent it, to Greenfield himself, laying out the specific legal provisions he was violating in terms that left absolutely no ambiguity. Greenfield backed down within 2 weeks. He told people in Caldwell that Frederick Brooks was a hard man, which made Thomas Ray's laugh for approximately 5 minutes when he heard it. "He didn't deal with Mr. Brooks," Thomas said. "He dealt with Mrs. Brooks, and she didn't even raise her voice." Frederick had looked at Olive with an expression of pure, unqualified pride when Thomas reported this, and she had felt it settle in her like something warm and lasting. The drought broke in September, and the autumn of 1887 was generous, the grass coming back and the cattle doing well, and the cooperative water arrangement having proved itself valuable enough that 2 additional ranchers asked to join it. Olive formalized the expanded agreement over the winter with a precision that would have stood up to scrutiny in any Kansas courtroom. In the spring of 1888, they had another son. They named him Thomas, after Thomas Ray's, who was so visibly moved by this that he excused himself to go check on something in the barn for an extended period of time, and returned with suspiciously red eyes. Thomas Ray's the foreman became Thomas's godfather by unanimous agreement, and the relationship between the small boy and the broad-shouldered man became one of the most enduring features of life at the Doubleby, a gruff and devoted friendship that began when Thomas, the elder held Thomas the younger for the first time, and the baby grabbed his finger and refused to let go. James was 4 and absolutely certain that his new brother was primarily a source of entertainment. Ruth was 3 and considered the new baby an intrusion on her status as youngest, but adapted to the situation with a generosity that surprised everyone, and that probably said something about how she had been raised. Olive recovered from this birth more quickly than from the previous ones. She was back at her desk within 6 weeks, which Frederick pretended to object to, and which she paid absolutely no attention to, because she knew, and he knew she knew, that doing the work was part of what kept her herself, and he would not have changed her for anything. By 1889, Kansas was undergoing one of those periods of change that were visible to people who paid attention to the currents running beneath ordinary life. The cattle trade was shifting, the great trail drives that had defined Caldwell beginning to diminish as the railroads pushed further south and the ranges changed. Farmers were arriving in numbers that were transforming the landscape, fencing land that had been open, changing the relationship between the ranching economy and the wider one. There were tensions, as there always were when ways of life were ending and new ones were beginning. Frederick had been thinking ahead of it for 2 years, which was characteristic. He had diversified the double B, adding wheat to complement the cattle, a decision that required investment and risk, and that Olive had evaluated with him over several evenings at the kitchen table, going through numbers and projections with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. "The wheat is right," she had said, finally. "I think so too," he had said, "but I wanted your eyes on it." This was what they had become, which was the most useful and also the most invisible thing in a partnership, the habit of checking their thinking against each other, not because either of them lacked confidence, but because the combined view of two people who paid attention and told each other the truth was simply better than either single view alone. The wheat prospered. By 1890, the Double B was one of the more stable operations in the region precisely because it had not bet everything on the cattle trade that was changing. Martha Aldridge, who had retired from the boarding house in 1888 and was living with her niece in Caldwell, came to stay at the Double B in the summer of 1890, when her health began to require more consistent attention than her niece could provide alone. She occupied the spare room off the kitchen and presided over mealtimes with the enthusiasm that had always been her most defining quality, and she was beloved by all 3 children with an intensity that she received with tremendous dignity. She lived 2 more good years. She died in the early spring of 1892 in the spare room off the kitchen, with Olive holding her hand, and it was a quiet and not undignified death, the kind that people who have lived with purpose are sometimes fortunate enough to have. The funeral was in Caldwell, and the entire town came, because Martha Aldridge was the kind of person whose passing was felt by everyone who had known her. Olive cried at the funeral and did not try to hide it, which Frederick noticed and said nothing about, simply staying close in the way he had, standing at her shoulder with the steady presence that she had relied on for a decade now, without ever fully saying how much she relied on it. She told him that night, finally, what she had not fully articulated before, which was what Martha's friendship had meant to her in those first, solitary, carefully defended years in Caldwell. How Martha had been the first person to simply receive her as she was, without explanation or justification, and how that had been the beginning of everything that had come after. "She knew you would end up here," Frederick said. "She told me so once." Olive looked at him. "When?" "Before I asked you to dinner the first time," he said. "She said, 'Mr. Brooks, that woman needs someone who won't try to manage her, and if you're smart enough to understand that, you might have a chance.'" "Did she?" Olive said. "She also said I'd probably make a mess of it initially, but that you were patient underneath all the composure, which I found encouraging." "I am not particularly patient," Olive said. "You were patient with me," he said. She thought about this. "You were worth being patient with," she said, which was the most she was going to say about it, and which Frederick accepted with the expression that she had learned over 9 years of marriage, was his particular expression for moments when he understood she was telling him something important in the least demonstrative way she could manage. He pulled her close and she let him, which was also a kind of saying it. By 1892, James was 8 and already spending hours with Thomas Rays learning the horse management with a seriousness that Thomas found deeply satisfying. Ruth was 7 and had discovered books with the intensity that Olive recognized very clearly, because it was exactly how she had discovered them at the same age, and the supply of books at the Doubleby became a matter of ongoing attention and investment. Little Thomas was 4 and divided his allegiances between his godfather and the kitchen, where he had determined that food was the most interesting thing in the world, and had begun attempting to help with cooking with mixed results and great enthusiasm. Olive turned 36 that year. She was not the same woman who had arrived in Caldwell in the autumn of 1880, $43 in her hem and a secret she intended to carry alone, and she was also, in all the ways that counted, precisely herself. The clarity she had always had, the directness, the careful attention, the willingness to do the work that needed doing, all of that was as present as it had ever been. What was different was the weight she no longer carried and the room that had opened up inside her when she put it down. Frederick turned 41. He was more gray at the temples than when she had first sat across a telegraph counter from him, and the lines of his face were deeper, and he still moved with that absolute economy that she had found so striking and still found striking now. He also laughed more than he had when she had first known him, which she thought was probably something she had contributed and which she counted as a genuine accomplishment. She told him this once. "You laugh more than you used to," she said. "I take some credit for that." "Most of it," he said, which was such a complete departure from his usual understatement that she laughed immediately, which was exactly the point. In the autumn of 1893, a letter arrived from Richmond. It was from her uncle. He was old now and in poor health, and the letter was short and not quite apologetic, but it contained something adjacent to contrition, an acknowledgment that the arrangement he had attempted to make with Arthur Prescott had been wrong and a wish that things had gone differently. It was not the letter she might have written on his behalf if she had been composing it herself, but it was something. She thought about it for a week. She talked to Frederick about it, and he listened with the full attention he always gave her, not offering an opinion until she asked for one. "What would you want me to say?" she asked. "I want you to say what you actually think," he said, "not what you think you should think." What she actually thought was that her uncle was a small man who had made a series of weak choices and had tried to make her pay for them, and that she did not owe him forgiveness, but that carrying the weight of refusing to forgive him was not actually costing him anything. It was costing her. She wrote back. A short letter. Not warm exactly, but not cold. An acknowledgment that she had received his letter, and that she hoped his health improved, and that she had made a good life. She said nothing about the past, and she said nothing that wasn't true. She felt better after she sent it in the particular way of having put down something you have been carrying longer than necessary. "Well," Frederick said when she came back from the post. "Done," she said. "Good," he said. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. "Frederick." He looked up from the ledger he was working on. "I would not trade any of it," she said. "Not the hard parts, not the frightening parts, not the years in Caldwell alone or the being afraid or the walls I kept up too long. Because every piece of it came to here." She looked at him steadily. "To this, to you and to our children and to this house and this life, I would not trade a day of it." He looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes she had been reading for 13 years, and that she still sometimes found impossible to read completely, which she had decided was not a frustration but a pleasure, because it meant there was always something more to learn. "Neither would I," he said simply. She crossed the kitchen and kissed him, which she did with the same directness she brought to everything, and he kissed her back the same way he always had, with a completeness that left no room for doubt. Outside, James was in the pasture with Thomas Rays, and a particularly difficult young horse that was testing both of their patience. Ruth was at the kitchen table reading and making marginal notes in a book she had already read twice, and little Thomas was sitting in a square of afternoon sunlight trying to teach the ranch cat a trick that the cat was declining to learn with dignified consistency. The Doublebee sat in its place on the Kansas plain, with the afternoon light coming across the grass and the wheat stubble in long golden lines. And the sky above it was the enormous flat sky of the prairie, the sky that had made Olive feel small and exposed when she first arrived, and that now felt like something that belonged to her life, a daily and extraordinary thing that she was still not done being moved by. She had $43 once, sewn into the hem of her coat, and a secret she had thought would always be hers alone, and she had built from that beginning something she had not known was possible, a life that was genuinely hers and genuinely full, with work that meant something and friendship that sustained her, and a love that was the real kind, the kind that was made of daily honesty and mutual respect, and the particular pleasure of being known completely by someone who chose, every day, to stay. In the spring of 1894, Olive found herself expecting again. She was 37, and she told Frederick with a combination of certainty and mild exasperation that she found very characteristic of herself in this particular situation, and he received the news with the same expression he had received it the first time, that complete, unguarded stillness, and then he held her with the same care. "You don't need to be careful with me," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm being careful with the idea." She understood. "A fourth child is a lot," she said. "A fourth child is wonderful," he said, into her hair. "I'm being careful because I'm very grateful and I don't want to drop it." She laughed, and he held her a little tighter, and outside the kitchen window the Kansas spring was doing what it did, which was arriving with an abundance that never quite stopped being remarkable. Their fourth child, a son born in November of 1894, they named William. He came into the world in a snowstorm that was the worst November had offered in a decade, and he arrived yelling, which suggested opinions about his circumstances from the very first moment. He was healthy and loud, and had his mother's dark eyes and his father's dark hair, and the absolute certainty of a person who expected the world to be interesting, which, given the world he was entering, seemed like a reasonable expectation. James was 10, and regarded his new brother with the equanimity of someone who had been through this before. Ruth was 9, and declared William the most acceptable of the younger siblings, which was high praise from Ruth. Little Thomas was 6, and immediately attempted to teach William something, which was premature but well-intentioned. Frederick held William on the evening after the birth, when the house had quieted and the older children were asleep and the storm had settled to a low and steady wind, and Olive was resting but not sleeping, watching him in the lamplight. "4," she said. "4," he agreed. "We are, apparently, not done accumulating people," she said. "I don't think that was ever really a possibility with you," he said, which was true, and which was also about much more than children, about the way she moved through the world gathering people and looking after them and arguing with them and standing up for them, all the accumulated connections of a life lived with full attention. She held out her hand and he came to sit beside her on the bed, the baby in the crook of his arm, and she leaned against his shoulder and looked at their youngest son in the lamplight. "Frederick," she said. "Olive," he said. "I love you," she said, in the direct way she said things that mattered. "I love you," he said, in the quiet way he said things that were permanent. The lamp burned warm in the winter room. Outside, the Kansas night was wide and cold and clear above the snow. The stars, the absolute brilliant kind that only appeared when the air was dry and still. An extraordinary canopy above the Doublebee and the sleeping children and the barn and the wide flat wheat fields, and the pasture where the horses stood quiet in the cold. They had started with a telegram counter and a refusal and a second offer that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with something much larger, and they had come to this, to a house full of children and work that mattered and land that was theirs, and a love that was made of 13 years of honesty and daily choosing. It was not a perfect life. No life was. There would be drought years and difficult winters and disputes that required her letters and his patience. There would be years when the children were ill and years when the market turned and years when the work piled up past the edge of what seemed manageable. There would be losses, because life on the plains in 1890s Kansas was not gentle, and some of the people she loved would leave and some of the things she valued would change. But this was the life. This specific and irreplaceable life, on this specific stretch of Kansas plain, with this specific and extraordinary man who had offered her something modest and accepted her refusal, and then offered her something real and waited patiently while she learned, which took longer than it should have. That real was exactly what she had always wanted. Olive Covington Brooks pressed her cheek to her husband's shoulder in the lamplight of their bedroom on the Doubleby, listening to her youngest son breathe the slow, new breath of the very recently arrived, and felt the complete and particular peace of someone who has found every piece of what they were looking for, including the pieces they did not know were missing until they were found. Outside, the Kansas winter went on being itself, vast and cold and full of stars. Inside, everything was exactly right.